The sun was setting over the golden dunes of the Sahel, but this was no ordinary evening in West Africa. Something historic was happening, something that could shake the very foundation of the global financial order. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, and Niamey, the heart of Niger, two leaders sat across a massive wooden table, their faces calm yet determined. General Ibrahim Traoré and General Abdourahamane Tchiani, the two men who had defied Western dictates and chosen sovereignty over submission, were about to sign a deal that would echo through time. The plan: to build the first-ever joint African Gold Refinery, a massive project that would process West Africa's raw gold, not in Switzerland, not in London, not in Dubai, but right here on African soil. And even more daring, the trade from this refinery would completely bypass the US dollar. This was not just an economic move. It was a declaration of war on the financial colonialism that had chained Africa for generations. For decades, gold extracted from African soil had been refined abroad. Western corporations profited, while the very nations that owned the resources remained poor. But now, things were about to change. Burkina Faso and Niger had decided that Africa would no longer sell its gold raw. It would refine, price, and sell it on its own terms. As the meeting began, a silence filled the room. Cameras flashed, reporters waited, and then Traoré spoke, his voice steady, his tone commanding. "Brothers and sisters, Africa must rise with her own hands. We can no longer allow others to dictate the price of our sweat. From this day forward, our gold will serve our people, not their banks." His words thundered across the hall. The ministers nodded in agreement. Tchiani leaned forward, adding in his deep voice, "The time for begging is over. Together, we will show that Africa's strength is not in its exports, but in its unity." The audience erupted in applause. Outside, thousands of citizens gathered with flags of both nations, red, green, and gold shimmering under the late afternoon sun. People chanted, "Africa unite." For the first time in decades, hope was not imported, it was born at home. What made this move even more revolutionary was the structure of the refinery deal. Burkina Faso would provide the land, security, and power supply for the facility. Niger would invest the initial reserves and logistical infrastructure, and the profits, for the first time, would stay 100% within African borders. But that wasn't all. Sources close to the government confirmed that the refinery would operate under a new gold-backed trade settlement system, a digital network linking central banks in the Sahelalliance. It meant that Burkina Faso and Niger could trade oil, gas, and gold directly with each other, or with partners like Russia, China, and other BRICS nations, without touching the US dollar. This was a blow to the petrodollar system that had dominated global trade since the 1970s. Within hours of the announcement, Western media went into panic mode. Headlines screamed, "Burkina Faso defies IMF pressure." "New Sahel Gold Pact threatens Western dominance." U.S. officials call for urgent review of Africa's gold trade policies. Behind closed doors, analysts in Washington and Paris called it a geopolitical earthquake. For years, Africa's gold had quietly propped up Western economies. The vaults of the U.S. Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and the European Central Bank were filled with bullion sourced from the continent. Now, two of Africa's boldest nations had declared that those days were over. In the streets of Ouagadougou, celebrations erupted. Young people danced, women ululated, and men raised banners reading, "Our gold, our pride." For many, this wasn't just about economics, it was about dignity. It was about reclaiming what was stolen, and rewriting a story that had always been written by others. And yet behind the smiles and the speeches, both leaders knew the risks. They were fully aware that what they had just done would make them targets. History had shown what happened to African leaders who defied Western systems, from Patrice Lumumba to Thomas Sankara. But Traoré and Tchiani were cut from a different cloth. They didn't fear death, they feared silence. That night in the dim glow of his office, Traoré stood by the window, looking out over the capital city. His reflection merged with the flickering lights of Ouagadougou. He whispered to his aide, "They will come for us, but this time they will not win." The aide nodded silently. As the African sky turned from orange to deep indigo, the first step toward economic liberation had been taken. The joint refinery plan would be finalized within weeks. Engineers were already mapping the site. Satellite partners from Russia and technical teams from China had sent their first proposals. Africa was building, and this time it wasn't building for someone else. But what no one knew yet was that this single refinery could spark a chain reaction, one that might redraw the map of global finance forever. And as the world watched, one question echoed across the corridors of power from Washington to Paris. What happens when Africa finally controls its own gold? As dawn broke over Ouagadougou, the world was already awake and trembling. From Washington to Brussels, the ripple effects of the Burkina Faso, Niger Gold Refinery deal were being felt across the highest levels of power. In Paris, a closed-door meeting was called at the Élysée Palace. French officials, red-eyed and tense, discussed what they were calling an act of economic rebellion. The Minister of Finance slammed a stack of reports on the table. "If this refinery becomes operational," he growled, "it will destabilize our entire gold import chain. We could lose billions." Across the Atlantic in Washington, D.C., the tone was colder, more strategic. A senior advisor at the U.S. Treasury looked at a large screen showing maps of Burkina Faso and Niger, covered with markers of mining sites. "They're cutting us out," he said. "No dollar trade, no control. If this spreads, the entire petrodollar system could fracture." A CIA analyst, flipping through classified intelligence, added, "We underestimated Traoré. He's not just another populist. He's methodical, and he's aligning Africa with BRICS. If they tie their gold to Russia or China, we're looking at a new financial bloc emerging from the Sahel." Back in Africa, the atmosphere was electric. The deal had gone viral on social media. Hashtags like Africarises and Gold for Africans were trending across the continent. For the youth, Traoré and Tchiani had become symbols of resistance, young, unyielding, and unbought. In Ouagadougou University, a student stood before a cheering crowd and shouted, "We are not poor, we were robbed. Now we are taking it back." The crowd roared. But beneath the euphoria, there were shadows moving quietly. Western-backed NGOs began issuing statements, questioning the transparency of the refinery deal. Reports surfaced claiming environmental concerns, regional instability, and risks to democracy. It was the same old playbook, soft power disguised as concern. Traoré knew it. He called a late-night emergency meeting with his advisors. "They will not attack us directly," he said, his voice calm but sharp. "They will use words, reports, and sanctions. They will try to divide us, but this time we stay united." At the same time, Niger's President Tchiani addressed his people in a televised speech. "They want us to fear progress, but fear is the tool of the colonizer. We will no longer ask permission to prosper." The response from the public was overwhelming. Thousands gathered in front of government offices in Niamey, chanting "Down with the IMF" and "Gold for Africa." Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the United States and France began contacting neighboring governments, especially those still under Western influence. Offers of aid, new military deals, and economic partnerships were suddenly on the table. The goal was simple: to isolate Burkina Faso and Niger. But something unexpected happened. Instead of breaking away, Mali, Guinea, and Chad expressed support for the project. Mali's leader, Assimi Goïta, called it a golden bridge for African sovereignty. Even Ghana and Nigeria, though cautious, sent diplomatic teams to observe the progress. Africa was quietly choosing sides. In a matter of weeks, an idea that began as a bilateral partnership was turning into a continental movement. Experts called it the Sahel Economic Awakening. Western analysts called it a dangerous precedent. But what shook the Western establishment the most wasn't just the refinery. It was the new digital gold settlement system that came with it. It was reported that Burkina Faso and Niger had already begun testing a prototype digital token, a gold-backed African dinar GAD, developed in partnership with Russian fintech engineers and African coders from Kenya. If successful, it could allow nations to settle international trade instantly using physical gold reserves, without relying on SWIFT, the Western-controlled banking system. In a leaked conversation, a European Union diplomat warned, if Africa starts using its own gold-backed payment systems, the euro's dominance in African markets will collapse. But Traoré wasn't stopping. He summoned the heads of the mining corporations operating in Burkina Faso, mostly French and Canadian firms, and made his message clear. Either you refine our gold here in Africa, he said, or your contracts will be cancelled. The executives were stunned. One of them nervously protested. But President Traoré, this will hurt foreign investment. He cut him off immediately. Foreign investment built on exploitation is not investment, it's theft. The room went silent. Word of that meeting spread like wildfire across the continent. For many Africans, it was the boldest stance a leader had taken since Thomas Sankara. Posters of Traoré appeared on city walls from Dakar to Nairobi, bearing slogans like, "Africa is not for sale." But the resistance was just beginning. A confidential IMF memo leaked to African media revealed plans for targeted economic restrictions on Burkina Faso. Western banks began quietly freezing certain international transactions. Still, inside the new refinery headquarters in Ouagadougou, the construction had already started. Cranes lifted steel beams, engineers in helmets walked through muddy fields, and on every wall were banners that read, "Our gold, our future." As weeks passed, satellite images showed the massive complex taking shape. It would have 5 refining units, each capable of processing up to 300 tons of gold annually. Once operational, it would make Burkina Faso and Niger among the top 5 gold producers in the world, without Western oversight. And deep inside the main control room, a plaque had already been installed, engraved with words that summed up the entire revolution. For every drop of sweat stolen, we forge a bar of gold in return. The revolution was no longer a dream. It was being built brick by brick, gold by gold. But as construction advanced, something was stirring in the shadows. Intelligence reports hinted at covert meetings between Western agents and certain local politicians. Whispers of sabotage, bribes, and disinformation campaigns began to surface. The question was no longer if they would try to stop the refinery, but how far they would go. And as Traoré stood before his military council one night, he said quietly, "They may own the satellites, but we own the ground." The generals nodded. The battle for Africa's gold had just begun. Night fell over Ouagadougou, but the air was thick with tension. While most of the city slept, the presidential compound remained lit, a fortress of silence surrounded by soldiers on high alert. Inside, Captain Ibrahim Traoré was studying classified reports from his intelligence units. Each document told a story of betrayal, foreign agents entering under NGO cover, journalists suddenly appearing with investigative missions, and whispers of local politicians meeting in secret with embassy staff. Traoré placed the last file down and said quietly, "They've started the shadow war." And indeed, the West had moved into covert operation mode. Washington had greenlit a strategy labeled Operation Sandstorm. Its goal: destabilize the refinery project and tarnish Traoré's image as a dictator suppressing democracy. In Paris, French media outlets began releasing synchronized reports titled "Concerns over Human Rights in Burkina Faso's Mining Zones." British think tanks joined in, warning of economic risks from gold-backed trading. The messaging was coordinated, precise, and entirely predictable. But this time, Africa wasn't buying it. On social media, African creators and influencers countered every accusation with videos showing the refinery's progress. They filmed workers, engineers, and farmers speaking proudly about what the project meant for their future. One viral clip showed a young woman saying, "You called us poor when you stole our gold. Now you call us corrupt because we want to keep it." That one video reached over 50 million views across African platforms. Meanwhile, in Niger, President Tchiani convened his top security council. Intelligence reports confirmed that drones marked as UN aid monitoring were flying suspiciously close to mining areas. He ordered anti-air units to prepare for technical interception. By morning, 2 drones were grounded. The footage they contained shocked both governments: detailed schematics of refinery sites, lists of personnel, and encrypted transmissions to European servers. It was espionage, plain and direct. Traoré immediately went live on national television. "To the so-called powers of democracy," he said sternly, "we say this: Africa is not your laboratory. We are sovereign and we are not afraid." The speech went viral overnight. It was clipped, remixed, and echoed across the continent. In Senegal, protesters carried banners saying, "Burkina fights for us all." In South Africa, university students organized panels on the gold standard revolution. And in Mali, Gaïta sent a simple but powerful message of solidarity. "If they attack one of us, they attack us all." But the West wasn't backing down. Economic pressure began to tighten. Sanctions against key Burkinabe trade partners, delayed shipments of machinery, and international banks suddenly reviewing African accounts. Yet something unexpected began to unfold. As Western doors closed, Eastern ones opened. Within weeks, Russia, China, and even India stepped in to offer equipment, financial systems, and cybersecurity support. A Russian engineering firm agreed to install advanced refining technology in the facility, free of charge, as a sign of friendship between sovereign nations. At the same time, Chinese officials arrived quietly in Ouagadougou with a delegation of digital infrastructure experts. Their proposal was revolutionary: a blockchain-based gold trading system that would allow African nations to trade directly, bypassing Western financial networks. It was discreetly dubbed the Pan-African Exchange, PAX. In one historic meeting, Traoré, Tchiani, and Gaïta met in Niamey to sign the Sahel Gold Accord, officially recognizing PAX as their shared trade framework. The symbolism was monumental. The 3 nations of the Sahel, long exploited for their resources, were now dictating their own economic rules. But while the leaders celebrated, Western intelligence agencies panicked. They had underestimated the speed of Africa's cooperation and its digital leap. A U.S. intelligence memo, later leaked by whistleblowers, stated, "The Gold Refinery Alliance has transformed from a localized initiative into a strategic threat to Western monetary influence in West Africa. Immediate countermeasures required." Those countermeasures came fast. Western-backed militias operating in border regions suddenly became more active. Supply trucks headed for the refinery site were attacked. Power grids near Niamey were sabotaged. But instead of chaos, something extraordinary happened. The people defended the project. Civilians, miners, students, traders formed volunteer patrols to protect convoys and guard refinery zones. Farmers used their tractors to block roads, leading to suspected militant bases. For the first time in decades, the people were defending an economic project, not protesting it. Because this wasn't just about gold, it was about dignity. In one scene captured by local news, an old man stood in front of a damaged truck, his voice trembling. When they took our gold before, no one protected us. Now we protected ourselves. It was a moment that defined the new Africa. By the end of that week, the refinery's first test batch of processed gold bars was completed, stamped with the seal. Made in Africa, not for export. The news shook global markets. Gold prices fluctuated sharply. Western investors rushed to issue panic analyses. But in Ouagadougou, there was calm and quiet pride. Traoré looked at the first gold bar placed in his hands and whispered, This is what freedom feels like." Yet deep inside, he knew the hardest phase was still to come. Because when you challenge an empire, it never goes quietly. The dawn over Ouagadougou carried a strange silence. It wasn't peace, it was anticipation. The refinery had begun production, the people were united, and the gold bars lay stacked in vaults, gleaming like symbols of a long-awaited victory. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré knew that in the eyes of the West, this victory was an act of war. Inside a dimly lit conference room, his top advisors gathered. Military intelligence officers, economists, and foreign policy experts sat in tense silence as Traoré spoke. "They've tried to destroy us with guns," he said slowly, "and failed. Now they'll come with currencies and contracts. This time we strike first." He unveiled a confidential plan, codenamed Operation Sovereign Shield, a counter-strategy to protect Burkina Faso and its allies from the West's next assault. Economic warfare. Within days, the pressure began. The U.S. Treasury officially sanctioned key Burkinabe banks, citing suspicious trade with non-democratic nations. European financial institutions froze, accounts tied to the Sahel Gold Accord. And global headlines screamed with orchestrated hysteria. Africa's rogue gold bloc threatens stability. BRICS manipulates Burkina Faso's resources. But this time, Africa didn't flinch. Traoré called an emergency summit in Bamako. Leaders from Mali, Niger, Guinea, Chad, and even the Central African Republic arrived under heavy security. The agenda: to build a Pan-African Economic Defense Council. Their goal: to coordinate financial resilience, currency stabilization, trade independence, and resource security across the continent. As the meeting began, Traoré rose, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Brothers and sisters, we have fought colonization once with rifles. Today, we fight it with knowledge, technology, and unity. The gold they once stole from our soil will now finance our future, not their luxury." The crowd erupted into applause. The leaders signed the Bamako Declaration, a document affirming that no African nation under the alliance would trade natural resources using the US dollar ever again. The decision was bold, dangerous, revolutionary. Washington's response was immediate. American think tanks began flooding international media with expert analyses, warning of economic collapse in West Africa. NATO intelligence briefings described Traoré as a rising anti-Western populist threat. And rumors circulated that a coalition of Western nations was preparing covert intervention disguised as stabilization operations. But the Sahel Alliance had anticipated every move. Under Operation Sovereign Shield, Russian cyber units were already reinforcing Burkina Faso's digital infrastructure. Chinese financial experts had embedded themselves in regional banks to create alternate transaction networks outside the SWIFT system. In less than a month, the alliance launched AfriPay, an independent digital payment platform that connected local economies using gold-backed reserves instead of fiat currencies. For the first time in modern African history, small traders, farmers, and businesses could transfer funds across borders without Western intermediaries. The result? Western sanctions useless. Traoré smiled when he received the first data report. Over 2.5 million transactions processed within a week, worth hundreds of millions in gold value. He turned to his advisors and said, "They can sanction our banks, but they cannot sanction the spirit of Africa." Meanwhile, in Washington, a closed-door meeting took place at the Pentagon. Senior military and intelligence officials reviewed classified satellite images of the Sahel, the gold refinery, the new tech hub, the cross-border trade routes. It was all mapped in red. One general slammed the table. "This man is building a parallel system. If this model spreads to Central or Southern Africa, we lose our last foothold on the continent." The room fell silent. The next phase of confrontation had begun, and it wouldn't be fought with tanks or planes, but with information, sabotage, and manipulation. Within weeks, social media platforms flooded with propaganda videos claiming human rights abuses and child labor at the refinery. Anonymous accounts pushed rumors of internal conflict between Burkina Faso and Niger. It was a digital war, and Traoré knew it. He addressed the nation in a powerful speech broadcast across all Sahel networks. "When you cannot defeat a people with armies, you try to poison their minds. But Africa has learned. We see your lies. We reject your puppets. We will build, and no amount of deception will stop us." That speech became iconic, replayed across Africa, subtitled in French, English, Arabic, and Swahili. As the months passed, progress continued. The joint refinery expanded. Additional units were planned in Mali and Niger, and regional universities began offering degrees in resource engineering and African economics. For the first time, the continent wasn't exporting raw gold. It was exporting refined value. The IMF's reports showed confusion. The so-called unstable African bloc was posting steady GDP growth, and local currencies were stabilizing due to gold-backed confidence. Western investors couldn't comprehend it, an economy growing without their involvement. Traoré, watching the data on his office screen, murmured, "They said we needed their aid to survive, but all we ever needed was freedom." In a symbolic gesture of unity, the first Pan-African gold coin was minted and displayed at an international press event in Ouagadougou. The coin bore the emblem of a rising sun over Africa and the words, "Sovereignty is our wealth." Crowds filled the streets as the announcement echoed across airwaves. Children waved flags, women chanted songs of independence. And for a moment, the entire continent felt the same heartbeat: pride, resistance, rebirth. But amid the celebrations, Traoré remained cautious. He knew that empires don't vanish quietly. And while Africa was awakening, the world's old powers were regrouping. In his closing address to the nation, he said, "We are not against the West, we are against exploitation. We are not rejecting friendship, we are rejecting slavery in disguise. Africa must stand on its feet, because no one else will carry it with honesty." He paused, looked directly into the camera, and added, "And to those who still doubt us, look at this gold, forged from our soil, refined by our hands. This is Africa's new signature." The broadcast went viral, over 80 million views across platforms. Analysts called it the speech that changed Africa's narrative. And as the world watched, one truth became undeniable. The age of Africa's silence was over. If you want to see more stories like this, of nations rising, leaders defying odds, and Africa reclaiming its destiny, make sure to subscribe, because this is just the beginning of the revolution.